Jessica's got her husband, Dan. I'll let her introduce the family in more detail, but Dan and then her son Kevin is with us. And so I'm going to turn it over and let Christine finish. Give a hand for Christine Boyle.
Yes, okay, cool. All right. I think I'm going to use the microphone. I'm not as loud as you.
I am kind of loud.
You are. Okay, is that too loud or is that, no, I think that's good. Okay. The funny thing about the Disney stuff is I feel like my husband plans it all and I just pack and show up. So he's the real Disney fan. Well, I am so excited to be here. And one of the reasons I'm excited is because I love Scott and Julie. When I met them in Orlando, I was like, I want to be your best friends. And we just connected and I loved hearing about what they're doing. But Dan and I work for Young Life, Capernaum in Cleveland, have been on staff with them for 7 years. But a lot of our kids are aging out. And, you know, a lot of times this happens in Young Life Capernaum that they're supposed to age out at 22 and you end up with 25-year-olds, 30-year-olds, and you have no plan for them. And that's kind of where we're at, where we only have about 3 kids who actually meet the age requirements for Capernaum. And so we've kind of been at this place of, okay, Lord, what's next? And then we've had some really interesting church experiences that I'm going to get to share with you today. And that's provoked a lot in us of like, what do we do with these painful experiences, God? What do we do with this? And so meeting Scott and Julie at Disability in the Church just kind of gave Dan and I a vision for some of the things we want to see happen in Cleveland. So we're kind of in the works of working on starting an adult ministry, hoping and praying that by January, we're doing something like this in Cleveland. So we're really excited. I mean, when I say that, like genuinely so excited to be here with you guys today. But I'm going to just start off and tell you our family story, just so you understand the perspectives that I'm bringing today, and just so you understand Kevin and Dan. And I guess just to start off, if Kev makes noise, is that okay? Because Dan's like, my husband's anxious and is going to move Kevin out of the room. And if we're okay with Kevy being a little loud, then Kev's going to stay in the room. So, okay, cool. You don't have to leave, hon. So my story started really, I found out I was a week before I was supposed to leave for college, I found out I was pregnant, and I found myself in an abortion clinic ready to have an abortion, thinking that was my only option. I was confused, I was hopeless, I was devastated, I was scared. But the night before that abortion appointment, I prayed to God and I said, Lord, keep me from doing this because I can't keep myself from doing this. It was to this day probably the most desperate prayer I've ever prayed to God. And in that abortion clinic the next day, God answered that prayer. He literally made it impossible for me to have that abortion. I was told that I was 6 months pregnant and too far along to have an abortion in that clinic that day. And, you know, a lot of times people are like, oh my gosh, how are you 6 months pregnant? But what I knew and experienced that day was that God had just intervened. He had just showed up in my life. He had just entered into my story. He had just entered into the mess, right? And it was in that clinic that I finally surrendered my life to Jesus. It was there in that clinic that it wasn't anything fancy. It was literally, Lord, my life is so screwed up and I need you. And I left that clinic. And even though I'd experienced Jesus, even though I'd experienced this God moment and came to Christ, I still had to go home and tell my cousin, who was going to be my roommate, that I wasn't leaving to go to Kentucky with her. I had to go home and tell the father of the baby, you're going to be a dad in 4 months. I had to go home and tell my whole family I wasn't going away to college and I was pregnant. I had to eventually walk back into my church and tell people why I wasn't away at college, Christian college too, I was supposed to go to. that added a little bit of stress. But the biggest challenge was, and I didn't even know it, was 4 months later, I was going to have a daughter born with significant and lifelong disabilities. And so my daughter, Courtney, was born 4 months later. The cool thing is, about 3 days after being in that abortion clinic, a friend of mine from high school literally showed up at my house. And he said, Christine, my girlfriend's mom is starting a Christian support group for teen moms in Cleveland. Will you meet her? What are the chances of that, right? And I said, sure, I'll meet her. And so I went to a restaurant and I sat across the table with this woman. Her name was Betsy. And she shared with me that she had been a teen mom and that she ended up meeting a man who adopted her son, and they went on to have 7 more kids together. So she was a mom of 8. She was working in full-time ministry. And she declared Jeremiah 29:11 over my life. And she put my name in that verse. She said, "For I know the plans I have for you, Christine, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future." All the things that I felt like I was losing being a teen mom and preparing to be a teen mom. But she told me she was gonna love me, she was gonna walk alongside me, and she did just that. She invited me into her home. She taught me how to be a wife. She taught me how to be a mom. And she discipled me. She invited me to start attending her church, which I did. And to put it in perspective, she was there the day Courtney was born, and she was there 21 years later when our daughter died in the hospital. And so this has been a lifelong friendship. This was my first experience with Young Life. This was Young Life's ministry to teen moms, Young Lives, getting started in Cleveland. And so I want you just to, for a second, just understand how significant relational ministry is. This woman loved me when everyone else was walking away from my life, when my mom was kicking me out of the house because I was pregnant, when I was living in an apartment by myself with my baby girl with disabilities. This woman was pouring into my life. Relational ministry matters. It matters greatly. So here I am with Courtney. She's 3 months old, has significant disabilities, and I meet this guy at church. And we become friends, and we're friends for about a year. And then all of a sudden he decides he wants to date me. And I remember vividly, like, friends of ours saying, "Dan wants to ask you on a date." And I just cried. I mean, most girls get excited, right? I just cried. I'm like, why does he want any part of our lives? Our lives were crazy. I was 19 then. We're living on welfare. I couldn't work because she was so disabled. And, she had profound disabilities. We're in and out of the hospital like crazy. And he watched this for about a year. And yet he still wanted to date me. And Dan entered into our lives and was an answer to the prayer I was praying to God, asking for a dad, asking for a husband. And he loved Courtney so beautifully and has been an amazing husband the last tomorrow, 22 years. Woo. So Dan came into our lives and was just incredible. Well, a handful of years later, God clearly called us to adopt Kevin from El Salvador. So I went to El Salvador in 2005 on my very first missions trip, and loved the country, loved the people, and kept going back year after year. On my 3rd trip at this children's home in El Salvador, Kevin had come to the children's home. He was 3 years old and he weighed 14 pounds. And I had, he was the only kid with a disability. And so my heart was drawn to him because he had disabilities. We ended up becoming sponsors for him, which meant we sent monthly, money to help support Kevin. But then the next year I went back and he was 4 years old and he was 14 pounds. And then the next year I went back and he was 5 years old and 14 pounds. And it was there on that trip that I was reading a book by John Erickson Tada, who I'm sure most of you know. It was called When God Weeps. Beautiful, beautiful book about the theology of suffering. And I was really reading it for God just to minister to my heart about Courtney and kind of this theme of suffering that was just kind of a part of our lives. And yet Johnny does such a beautiful job explaining how suffering has become the status quo because we've allowed it to be. The church has allowed it to be. We kind of throw up our hands and say, God's sovereign, God's good, and we ignore suffering and we don't do anything to alleviate it a lot of times. Where what Jesus showed us in the Bible was, he bent over backwards often to alleviate suffering. And so this book all of a sudden, and the Holy Spirit was like, Jesus wouldn't come here and see this little boy and do nothing. And so everything in me was like, oh no, we're supposed to adopt him. Oh no. And so I go home and I tell Dan, I'm like, I think we're supposed to adopt Kevin. And we both were like, we can't do this. This is crazy. But we kind of wanted to be good Christians. So we said, okay, we'll buy a Bible study about adoption. We'll do this Bible study just to kind of do it, right? Well, sure enough, this Bible study walked you through the process of adoption and wanted to really encourage the husband and wife to be on the same page. So they encouraged us, make a list of pros and cons about adoption. And since we knew Kev, we knew him well, our list of pros and cons were very specific to Kevin. And I'll be honest with you, our list of cons were probably about 3 times longer than our list of pros. Our list of cons were everything from, Lord, how do you push 2 kids in wheelchairs? Lord, we're big Dave Ramsey people. We just got out of debt. Like, we don't have $40,000 to adopt him. We're living in a 2-bedroom apartment. We don't even have a room for him. The list went on and on. What do you do when you have to call 911 at 2 in the morning and one's hospitalized and one's at home? It was a good list. You guys would agree with it. I mean, honestly, you probably would have agreed with it. But finally, it took us through scripture and all the scriptures that we know about caring for the least of these, laying down your lives for others. Whatever we do for the least of these, we're doing to Jesus, about offering and extending hospitality, all those things. And Dan finally said it perfect. He said, none of these reasons are good enough to stand before God and give someday. And so we said, okay, we'll pursue Kevin. And that was it. And we just decided, we'll do this. We'll try our best and do everything we can to get him here. And it took 4 years, 4 long years. There were times where we didn't know if it was going to happen. There were times where we didn't know if he would even live through it. But he came home to us after 4 years as an 18-pound 9-year-old. So Kev's 21, believe it or not, Kev's 21. But he was literally wearing 12-month-old baby clothes at 9 years old. I could hold him like this in my arms. And I love sharing that story because I think it just reminds us like how easy we can miss God's call, how easy we can miss his invitation to do his work, and how his heart really is to restore. His heart really is to alleviate suffering and care for the least of these, to care for the disabled. And often when I think of just how profoundly Kevin has impacted our lives and the joy he brings and how I couldn't even imagine this life without him, and I stop and remember, like, I could have missed this. If it was left up to us and our flesh, we would have missed this. We would have said no. Our biggest objection to God was, Lord, we're good, we're content. We don't want more kids. We're good with just Courtney. But God knew, and he dragged us to the cross, kicking and screaming, but he knew that Kevin needed to be a part of our family. So that's our family. As I said, Courtney, she passed away 2.5 years ago at the age of 21. And so I'm going to tell you a couple stories today just about some of our recent church experiences. And I think, as Scott was showing on that slide, the different people that have spoken. Brad Mowry, for those of you who were here when Brad was here, Brad's a special needs dad. And so I know he spoke a little bit about that. Sorry, my bad. But I guess I would say, just to start off, I just want to be really clear. I love the church. I love the church. But the experiences I'm going to share with you today are very raw, very real experiences that we have had as a family. And Scott and I were texting the other day, and I said, wow, it's so exciting for me to see God using some of the pain we've walked through as a family, finally, like, using it for good. And so just know my heart in this, that I'm going to speak really transparently so that you really understand what families need. And this may feel and sound different than some of the people you've heard before, but again, I think we need to hear from parents. We need to hear from families who are really doing this life. And so this first experience I want to share with you is what I'll call our home church that we've been at. I started attending when I was pregnant with Courtney, and Dan has been there, we said the other day, maybe 34 years total. So we're looking at over 2 decades for me, over 3 decades for Dan. And we were a very idolized family, I would say, very well known, very plugged in, very involved. The family that, like, oh, they're amazing, they have disabled kids, right? That's what happens to a lot of special needs families. But when Court went into the hospital 7 weeks before she died, we did not hear from our church once. Even before we knew she was dying, and that was only the last 36 hours. We were there for, 7 weeks, and she was in kidney failure, and she was going to come home on dialysis. And kind of a funny thing I would say is, okay, we can do dialysis. She just has to be able to go to Disney World and Young Life Camp. And I was serious. I was like, she is going to Young Life Camp, and she is going to Disney World, no matter what. And that was really hard for us, you guys, that our church was absent. Our church was absent through the hardest time of our life. And, we're big Facebook people when it comes to just kind of using social media to give updates and stuff. And that when we finally knew she was going to die, and this was in the midst of COVID, and so the only people that could visit were clergy. So keep that in mind too. We couldn't have just our friends come and see us. Kevin couldn't even be with his sister until they opened up compassionate visitation. And so I posted on Facebook, she's going to die within the next day or so. And, our head pastor showed up, just showed up into our room. And one of the questions he asked us was, who's been walking alongside you through this? And that was one of the hardest questions, I'll be honest. I mean, I've had to have counseling over that question. It was a really hard question because I was like, I don't know what he wants me to say. Not you, not the church. I don't know. I don't know what he wanted me to say. I don't think he knew what to say, to be honest with you. But I'm going to tell you this. Chick-fil-A that we love, that's in my husband's school district. We did an adoption fundraiser there. We hang out there with our Young Life kids. They showed up. They texted us and they said, how can we help? Can we bring you guys lunch? And we're like, sure. They showed up with a wagon and fed the entire PICU, the staff. And the manager just wrapped me in his arms and just wept with me. Chick-fil-A showed up more than our local church did. And again, I'm not saying that to bash the church. I'm saying it because we've had to really process what happened. And we've tried to handle the situation as biblically as we could. But I'll be honest, it took us a year. It took us a year to finally go to the elders and say, we are so hurt. But in that year, we went to church twice. That was it. We couldn't walk in there. We tried and we couldn't. But nobody checked on us. Nobody asked us how we were doing. And when I sat with one of the elders and finally said, we are so hurt, he looked at me and he said, but we have night to shine. And he was sad, don't get me wrong. He was grieved with me, but he said, but we have night to shine. And that's one of the precedents I'll say that we're setting a lot of times in disability ministry is that disability is an event. It's a program. And we weren't looking for an event. We weren't looking for a program. We wanted to be seen. We wanted to be known. We wanted to belong. We wanted to be loved. We wanted to be cared for. And so we've kind of walked through this very interesting process with our church. And we ended up coming to the realization that until they make some significant changes, this isn't a safe place for our family at this point. But we're like, hey, we'll help you in any way we can, And we've had to have a lot of reconciliation with our church, but it doesn't change what we experienced. And one of the things the head elder said to us was, you guys are like the poster children for special needs. And I said, yeah, that's why this is so sad, because if the Boyles can fall through the cracks, anybody can then. So then during this process, we decided we'll try a different church. And this was a church that a friend of Dan's, who he works with, invited us to visit. And so we go to this church. So again, first church we're trying. And we sit in the back row of this church. And I'll say this real quick just about Kevy. Kev's not a morning person. And we drove 6.5 hours last night and got in late. So he's tired. He's usually wild, crazy, happy, but he's still not a morning person. And so we're at church that morning. We're in the back row. And as parents, we know you never know what's going to happen with a child with a disability. And so do we always plan a little way of escape? Absolutely. So we're in the back row. And Kev's kind of doing his little sleepy noises, kind of like he's making now. But for the most part, he was really doing great. And he's even clapping for the pastor. And as he's clapping, I'm just watching the pastor's face just change. And I'm like, oh, he is overtly ticked. He does not like this. He is frustrated. And so sure enough, this kind woman comes up to us, kind of crouches down behind us and says, hey, just so you know, we have an overflow room. And we're like, oh, no, he's good. We're good. Thank you, though, but we're good. you know, and then Kev's still clapping. And at one point, I will admit this, at one point he did a loud, kind of like what he's doing now, little loud yelp. And I even was like, you know, and I covered his mouth. But other than that, he, like as a parent, I didn't feel like he needed to leave the room. I didn't. And I know, you know, and we obviously have our tolerance levels for what, you know, and even when he's happy, we want him when he's happy there. But then a male came up to us, and we didn't know this at the time, but it was an elder of the church. And he kind of crouched down behind us and said, you know, we have an overflow room, a cry room. And we're like, oh, he's good, he's good. And he goes, well, the pastor's distracted. You guys need to leave the sanctuary. And we were like, oh, okay. So you're not asking us now, you're telling us. And we got up and we walked out towards the doors to exit. And they're like, oh, no, you don't have to leave. And we're like, no, we're going to go. And so we start walking out to the Boyle party bus. And sure enough, a few minutes later, he follows us out. And he comes up to us and he says, I'm so sorry, but we can't accommodate this. It's a small church, the acoustics, and I'm just a crier. When I'm angry, when I'm frustrated, I just cry. And I was just bawling at this point. And I just said, this is not the heart of God. This is not what Jesus would do. This is a leadership issue. This, you know, and I was just saying all those things. I work in ministry and we would never do this to these kids. And he just threw up his hands and he said, I'm so-and-so, I'm an elder, you can blame me. You can blame me. And so there was even this little arrogance of, I think I'm doing the right thing. Like, you can blame me. And so we got in our van and we drove home that day. And the things we contemplated as we drove home were, what if it was the first time we were trying church? What if we were brand new, had never, not a Christian family? I mean, thank God we love Jesus and we're going to go back. Okay? You know, we're going to go back to a church. We're not going to give up on Jesus, right? Thank goodness that was our case. But what if this was a family who was saying, we're finally going to try church? That could be devastating. Well, the irony of the story is my husband taught both of the pastor's kids. So I said, I'm going to give it about 5 minutes until he realizes it's the Boyle family that he just kicked out. And so we realized, we knew a text or something was going to be coming, right? So sure enough, we had a conversation with the pastor that night. And, you know, you're so hoping it's going to be, we didn't know what to do. Give us another try. Let us make this right. Like we're so hoping that was going to be the case. But really it was more, I know you guys go to that church. What do you do with Kevin there? And I wish this wouldn't have happened, but my staff just knows if I'm distracted, get rid of the distraction. And, you know, we just tried to lovingly encourage him that this isn't a distraction, or what you think is a distraction can actually be the biggest blessing to your congregation. And so it definitely was a very, very, very painful experience. But as I shared that experience, and I did share it on social media, I'll be honest, I did share it on social media, but I said, don't ask me the name of the church, it's irrelevant. And the truth is, it is irrelevant. But the response I got from families, because I thought what we experienced was abnormal, the families that just commented and said, this is why we haven't stepped foot in a church in 10 years. This happened to us too. And then the more I'm researching this and understanding, 1 in 3 families leaves not even just a church, their church, because they don't feel like their child belongs. 1 in 3. That's insane. That's insane. But so I realized what we had just experienced was very common to the disability community, very common to the families that have kids with autism and have behaviors and just feel like they can't find a place to welcome them and love them. So I want to use those 2 church experiences to kind of just talk through what could have been different, what could look different in those situations. So as I shared how that pastor or that elder had said from our home church, you know, but we have night to shine. Again, I just want to emphasize events are not what families are looking for. And even as I share that story about Young Life coming into my life, that's why I emphasize so much relational ministry. Families like ours, we just want relationships like all of you guys want. We just want community and belonging like all of you guys want. We're no different. It's just a lot harder for us. I mean, to this day, I could tell you, we don't have a church. We're still trying to find where we belong. And, you know, we've said like the time in our lives where we've needed the church more than ever, we feel like it was pulled out from underneath us and we don't have that. And then when I told you that the elder had said, you guys are like poster children, kind of same thing. I don't want to be a poster child. I want to be seen. I want to be known. And the saddest thing, I guess, to me as Courtney died was I guess I realized we were known from afar. We were known, we were idolized, everyone knew us, but nobody really knew us. Nobody really knew us. And one of the reasons to this day I say I've loved Young Life for 24 years. It's changed my life. But after she died, I loved Young Life even more. The people that rallied around her and rallied around our family were her Young Life leaders, her Young Life friends. And there's times where I really did stop and go, what if she didn't have Young Life? That ended up being her community. And then the church, the second church that asked us to leave, I think that could have been handled a million different ways. I really do. I think some of it could have been just let it be and grab us at the end and pull us aside and say, let's talk about this. What can we do to serve you? What can we do to care for you guys? I think removing us in the middle of that service probably wasn't the right way to handle it, and the outcome could have looked entirely different. But I want to share a quick video clip with you of this guy named Dr. Eric Carter, and I hope he gets to this someday because he's really amazing. He's kind of known as like the theological guru of disability. But Dan and I watched a YouTube video from him, and as he was talking, I was like, this is it. He said it perfectly. So let me share this with you. See if this works. Nope. Oh, let's try that again.
Now, I want to emphasize, because I assume that some of you might be church leaders here in this room or streaming online, how important it is what happens or what's communicated from the pulpit in terms of promoting acceptance. And I understand a lot of you have come from very different religious traditions, and so some of you are going to struggle more with this than others, but let me make a few suggestions. You're in pretty good shape in your church if you've got a pastor who's completely unfazed when someone answers aloud his rhetorical questions in the middle of the sermon. That's a pretty good sign. Who designates the entire sanctuary a no-shush zone. You are not allowed to turn and shush someone. If you've got a pastor who, instead of sending a person who's making a little noise to the cry room, instead says, let's take the people who can only worship in total silence and send them to the cry room.
Right,
and the
right.
rest of us who are okay with a little noise can be out here. That flips sort of where the real barrier is, doesn't it? Pastor who doesn't require you to master all points on a sermon to be able to come back to the sanctuary next week. The person who says, we're willing to try things a little bit different if it brings someone else in.
Isn't that good? When I heard that, I was like, yes.
Now, I want to emphasize, because I assume that some of you might be church leaders here in this room or...
Sorry about that. Let's see. I want to just switch to the other one, down. Okay. Yeah, I loved that. When I saw that, I was like, yes, he nailed it. And I think that's so good. And, you know, even Scott, when he asked me to come and speak, he said, give them some ideas of like, how does this never happen at your church? And I was like, ooh, that's a really hard question. But I really think he hit the nail on the head. It has to come up front, and it has to come from the pastor who says, we're going to be okay, just like I just did. And honestly, I did that strategically with you guys to show how simple it is to say, Kevin's in the room. Are we all okay if he makes some noise? Because he belongs here. He needs to be here, right? So I want to give you an example too of kind of when this, I think a good example of when we experienced this. So at Courtney's funeral, we had Kevin obviously in the front row and some of her friends that have disabilities, more significant disabilities that kind of make a lot of noises and are nonverbal. And our dear friend Curtis did her funeral. And every time Kev would make a noise, he'd be like, yeah, Kay, you know, and he would just kind of call out Kevin. But I was thinking about it and thinking, how weird would it have been if somebody turned and shushed Kevin or shushed Maddie and Caitlin, some of Courtney's best friends, or expected them to leave the room? That would never have happened because it was Courtney's funeral. They belonged there, right? They needed to be there. They belonged there. And I was thinking about this the other day and I thought, but don't they belong in the church? Is it no different that they're children of God, masterpieces, as you guys so perfectly say? They belong there. And if someone ever looked at Kevin at his sister's funeral or her dear friends, some of her best friends, and said, you don't belong here, you need to leave, I would be like, how dare you, right? How dare us ever think that we have the right to ask someone to leave the house of God, to not be a part, to not belong? And I think we have to shift our thinking to think that way. They belong. They have a place there, even if it is a little bit of a distraction at times, right? Jesus loved distractions. I mean, the Jesus I read about, he welcomed distractions. He honored distractions. I mean, someone coming through the roof, right, with their friends, like, dang, that's a distraction. So I think we need to remember that. So those are a couple of the examples I would give based on those church experiences. So I'm going to kind of switch a little bit here. I recently did a podcast because, again, we are big Disney people. And I did a podcast from Disney because I've really felt like, why do I walk into Disney World and feel like I belong? Why do I walk into Disney World and feel like my family's been thought of? And Scott really encouraged me to share some of the key points I put in my podcast that was called What the Church Can Learn from Disney. And that might offend some people. I'm okay with that. I'll be honest, I am. Because I think the world can't beat us at disability, and it is. It is. If families feel more loved and cared for at Disney World, or feel like Target's more accessible than their church, we have an issue, you guys. We have an issue. And the cool thing is, you're sitting in this room, you obviously want to be a part of the solution. I want to be a part of the solution. So let me tell you some of the things I touched on in this podcast. I first touched on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I know sometimes that can get a bad rap for a variety of reasons. But the reality is, Disney is putting time and effort and money into training their cast members on how to care for people with disabilities. And I think it just really hit me that, like, we are not magically going to become places of belonging. We have to intentionally work to become places of belonging. We have to have hard conversations. We have to talk about where the church is failing. We have to talk about where the church is doing well. We have to talk about theology. We have to figure out how we're going to make our places accessible and work for people with disabilities, what we're going to do if there's distractions. But we have to be intentional. It's not just going to magically happen. And Disney is intentional with that. They're intentional. They create a place of belonging because they're putting effort, time, and money into that. The second thing I shared about was how when you go to Disney World, how the cast members and the characters, how they come close to you. They're not afraid. And so often we're afraid of people with disabilities, and the church can be afraid of people with disabilities. And so people naturally a lot of times keep their distance. And so I shared a story, and I'll share it with you today. One of the times we were there and we met this Tinkerbell. She got up in Courtney's, this is before Kevin, she got up in Courtney's face and she literally held Court's little head in her hands. and she kissed her all over her face. Like Court left that experience. I mean, I don't know, she was probably breaking tons of rules by doing that, but she was just like up in her face, just loving on her. And I mean, Court literally, I have pictures of her with lipstick marks all over her face. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't afraid. And Dan and I were like, she has to be a special ed teacher or something, right? But she wasn't afraid. They are trained to not be afraid. They're taught, they're educated, they're equipped. So you never feel like someone's like, oh, that kid scares me, or, oh, I don't know how to interact. And that's what makes families feel like they belong, is that in a world where everyone keeps their distance, in a world where you are known by afar, you walk into Disney World and you feel like they've been waiting for you. They are prepared for you. And we can't let the world do better at that than the church. The third thing I shared about is accessibility. And obviously with accessibility, we all know that if someone in a wheelchair can't get into your church, they're probably never coming back, right? Our churches, our spaces have to be accessible. And Eric Carter, who I just played for you, I love a quote he shares often. What does your building say about your theology? And, you know, I've been in churches that don't have accessible stages, or when Courtney got baptized, our church had to bring in a whole separate baptistry because the stage wasn't accessible to get to the baptistry. Did they make the effort to do that, to bring in a separate baptistry? Absolutely. But I kind of look at it and go, well, 20 years ago when you built the building, even though you're ADA exempt, you should have had an accessible stage, right? So we want there to be accessibility. We know that our places and our buildings have to be accessible for our families. And then the other thing is check on us. And this kind of goes back to what we were walking through as Courtney was passing away, where we felt like nobody checked on us. Nobody really asked us, what do we need? How can we serve you? How can we love you? But the last 2 times we were at Disney World, Kevin had 2 times where he puked, and we had to call in the middle of the night and ask for new sheets. And the next day, both times, staff called us in our room and said, how's your son? Is he okay? What can we do? And that probably sounds so stupid, but I'm like, if only the church did that. If only the church checked up, checked in, and asked families, what do you need? How can we serve you? How can we care for you? That's how you get to know your families. That's how you get to be a part of their world. That's how you get to be in that inner circle. That's how you get to really love them and care for them, is asking those questions, showing that you care. And then lastly, I talked about how Disney does pixie dusting. And this is just little special things that Disney does. And, you know, I love the slide Scott had showed about the 5 stages, and there was that pity stage. And I think we all know that a lot of times that is how the church and the world can look at people with disabilities, that pity. So I don't want this to come across as pity. And I think Disney somehow balances this really well. But they do special things for families that they recognize either have a disability, maybe are on Make-A-Wish, or are going through a hard time. And they do it in a way that isn't pity, but just more like, this is hard. And we're gonna acknowledge this is hard. And we wanna just do something to bless you, something. So I wanna share a little slide with you from when I did this recording at Disney, when I talk about a time when our family was pixie dusted. Oh, I should have had that slide up that whole time. Sorry, forgot. So I literally recorded it from Epcot. That's why I have yours on. I'm not weird. We had a trip, like this was literally 2-3 weeks after she died. And we decided we're still gonna take that trip. And we were down here with our cousins. And I remember Cousin Kelly went up to guest services. And I didn't even know she did this, but she explained the situation, you know, that Cord had passed away. And she just was kind of like, what can you do? Like, what can you do just to make this easy and special? And they gave us like anytime fast passes all day. It sounds stupid because it's like, how do you, what do you do when someone's like lost their child? Those are the only things you can do, is just think, I just want to do something kind. I just want to do something amazing. I just want to do something simple that will just bless this family. And I think Disney does a darn good job at recognizing, like, these kids, these parents, these caregivers, they just need that little piece. They just need those little things. And obviously in the context of Disney, it's going to be things like, you know, something maybe with a character, something with a fast pass, or, you know, maybe you get to go on this ride 3 times, right? Something special like that. So that was an experience that we felt like just shows, again, something that could be looked at as so simple, so silly, just like anytime fast passes. But it was them just recognizing this family needed a little blessing. And I think that's where the church can recognize this is hard. This is a lifelong journey for families. And they don't need pity, but they need people to understand their lives and what they're walking through, and how to come alongside them, how to care for them, how to show them and encourage them that they matter and what they're doing matters. I mean, being a caregiver, it's like it's a ministry. It's a ministry day after day after day. So those are some of the examples I wanted to give you. I know Scott was really, and I'm going to challenge you too. I hope my takeaway from this is, how do we not be churches like that ask people to leave? And again, I think that's a big question to try to figure out. And I hope I gave some examples of how do you just tackle that? How do you tackle it right from the get-go, that we're going to be a place of belonging, in whether it's in leadership. And I think it really does. You'll hear that a lot in disability ministry, that it does have to come from leadership. You know, whether you're trying to get something started, whether you're trying to create a culture of belonging in your church, or trying to even say that we would never let this happen in our church, it really does start with leadership. And so I would just say that I think that's where, you know, we have to encourage our pastors and our leaders, if you're a leader, that just setting the precedent right from the beginning, that we're going to be a no shush zone, right? I love that. It's so simple, but declaring that from up front, I think is the way to go. So I hope, I know you guys are going to have some homework to work on, but I hope that that this encouraged you, and again, just gave you a real insight to families and their experiences. And I guess I would just say, like, we need the church. We need the church. We all do, but we really need the church, families affected by disability. And the world will fill those deficits if the church doesn't fill them. So I think it's a call to rise up and fill where God's calling us to fill, and be places of belonging. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got some time. I'm going to ask you to process through a little bit of what you heard with folks at the table. I do want to point out that there is on your places, there's a business card for Christine. I hope you'll take that. One thing I hope you'll do is subscribe to her podcast. I listened to it. I was telling my daughter, Kelsey, I'm trying to tell her something. She's like, I know, I listened to that podcast. She's all right. And it really is. It's a good podcast. I got the guest on it, so I'm good on for that. But the other episodes are really good. But one thing, like she said, really, this hit me when you were doing your Disney podcast the other day, and you were talking about checking in on folks. And you said something to the effect of, you know, as people in the church and an organization, you can say, well, it's a big organization. You know, there's a lot of people. But it's not as big as Disney World, okay?
Right,
like
right.
Disney, you can check in on a random family staying in one of their 5,000 hotels.
Yep.
Then I think we can check in people in the church. There's nothing around here quite that big. And you know, we're not in a competition with the world. We are following God's, we're just like our own game, right? Like, it's God's game. But we are in the game of revealing what the kingdom of God looks like. And so if, I'm not against Target or Disney or Chick-fil-A, but if they're revealing the kingdom of God better than we are, then we need to look at our game. Look how we're doing. And so this goes to 1:30. I'm going to go over your homework with you in a moment, but first what I want you to do is it's at your tables, have a conversation, kind of process through what you just heard. And you can talk however the conversation needs to go, but I would suggest that maybe goes one of two ways or both of these two ways. One question is like, what are the things in your church that might need to be removed, addressed, talked to, or warned about proactively to not have the negative